in this course, or as I like to think of it, in this learning adventure, the learning environment. I'm also somewhat in that quandary and attempting to add to my own personal learning environment. I dipped into the Twitter sphere. You might have noted some of the tweets coming from Cookie1, which is my Twitter name, and you might have noted that they're disjointed and some have non-existent links, and I'm working on it. I just recently learned how to use bit.ly, Bitly, and I started a discussion on the use of Twitter within this MOOC. So please help me out, check it out, and help me sort it all out. Thanks. Please don't hesitate to experiment, ask questions, and just play with the new ideas, new concepts, new internet tools and toys, and have fun with the processes. Don't be afraid to fail to understand something or to use something. We connect in this venue, the MOOC, and beyond, and we learn from each other and build on that learning with each other. Today, we have George Siemens with us to discuss some of the keys to MOOC understanding and learning. The personal learning environment and network knowledge is the key. Many of you already know about George's globe-trotting adventures and global impact. And for those who may not, he's made major contributions to learners around the globe, and he's having a major impact on education systems around the globe. He shares his experiences and his adventures with any and everyone around the globe. And he's even been a speaker on TEDx, and that's been shared around the globe. So, without further delay, may I introduce to all of you, all around the globe, from somewhere in the world, a major globetrotter, George Siemens. The ball is now in your court, George.
Thanks, Carol. And first of all, I should extend an apology to all members of the group here for having to mess with your schedule. Sometimes when you're thinking around different time zones, you completely get things wrong, and I completely did that. So I do appreciate that Carol, Betty, and others were willing to adjust the schedule on such short notice. And for those of you that were inconvenienced, of course, my apologies. I'm going to look at the concept of open online courses from the perspective of personal learning environments, but in true fashion, I'm going to take a fairly meandering path in order to get there. Now, if you look at, let's say, the structure of information and how we've interacted with information traditionally, I think it gives you a bit of an indication of where we're going in terms of our tools and the kinds of resources that we need to do a better job accessing that information. I think many of you probably recall the wonderful days of hierarchical information, the period of Yahoo where you would go to the Yahoo site and you'd have nice little folders that someone organized for you. And that was really a well-curated web where we had this wonderful opportunity to go to a place and click a bunch of folders like we were still living in a physical world. Now, one of the problems with new technology is that on the one hand, it gets rolled out and we get it to do in a very McLuhan-esque sense what the old technology did. But once you bring it in, it does start to create new opportunities, and people inevitably sort of figure out what those new opportunities are. And that's what happened when Google stepped onto the stage 13 years and one day ago and started offering a way to access information that was distributed. So instead of trying to organize things in a strong, categorized manner, they opted to take an approach that was inherently networked and distributed. And I think that's precisely what needs to happen in terms of our learning content. More recently, and I don't quite know where these will end up, there's this notion of socialized information interaction, and that's something that I think most of us experience, whether in the form of Facebook, which is a Latin term that means spawn of the devil, or whether it's in a tool that's perhaps a little bit more social or a little less controlling of your information in the form of Twitter or similar tools. But essentially we're participating in these kind of social network structures, and we're using these to filter and make sense of our information. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. I mean, I'm starting to equate data ownership with land ownership, from 300 years ago, which means that if you don't own your data and if you don't own your spaces of interaction, then essentially you're a squatter and someone else is taking advantage of the benefits of your labor. But we'll pick that concept up in a little bit. And then, of course, now we're at an interesting stage where I don't know if we quite understand what this means yet. On the one hand, we have this growth of gamed information structures where we're being rewarded, whether it's simple things like badges and whether it's more complex approaches, such as actual game systems where you're trying to use these to teach. We're seeing a bit of a change in how we relate to that information again. And more recently, a tool that I'm absolutely fascinated by, Palantir, and our company, I should say, simply because of their connection with trying to make sense of the world at a really complex scale, the financial markets, U.S. military intelligence. So the information structure has really gone from hierarchical to gamed, and some kind of an analytics model being attached to it in what seems like, surprisingly, a period of less than 15 years. Now, the difficulty, though, and this is why we're seeing this trajectory of changes in how we interact with information, is that we literally don't have the ability to make sense of this stuff. I mean, in the current mechanisms that we've adopted. So as a consequence, we need to start looking for different ways and social systems in order to make sense of that information. And the problem is coupled or intensified by the fact that information is increasingly, from a school system, a diminishing value. Its data is critically valuable to many of the social web companies, and certainly is being used extensively to profile individuals. But in terms of what's the value of packaged curriculum, it's really getting down to a ballpark of zero. And one example that I find quite interesting is the illustration of Microsoft's Encarta. Initially, when they were rolling it out, and they did some focus groups, and it ended up being, wow, this thing is going to be, I paid $1,500 for this tool because it was an amazing concept at the time. By the time they rolled it out, though, they opted to go for, I believe it was the $395 price point, even though their focus groups stated they would pay lots more than that. By the time it actually shut down, I think they were selling it for, it was in 2009, they were selling it for about $20 or $22.95 or something like that. So the value of information in literally a period that runs about 15 years went from a really strong economic point, package structured information, to something that was worth ballpark zero. And the reason, it's very important to understand the reason behind this, is that the metrics of information creation and consumption are different when you're engaged in a online environment or a network environment than when you're engaged in more of a traditional setting. So the argument that I'm putting forward here is that because of who we are as people, and I'll bring up this concept of informavores next, but because of who we are as people, I think there's a reasonable argument to be made that we actually socialize as a means of making sense of information, namely that our desire to interact with a sensible world is to a fair degree what drives human social interaction. I don't think we socialize exclusively based on the sense of, it's human nature. I think socialization is a sense-making strategy that we incorporate. And this concept of informavores that Miller put out in 1983, I think is accurate here as well, in that, as individuals, we do quite literally solicit and seek information in such a fashion that it's almost on par with other biological models. For example, Paroli and Card in 95 put out a paper where they talk about information foraging as this process where we seek information as if we are seeking food. And it's this activity of finding it, handling it, making sense of it. And so information foraging is something that we do through these social networks that we participate in on a daily basis. And these social networks, though, are transitioning because they're increasingly becoming informationally or analytics-driven networks. And that has some significant implications in an educational context. But I'll tease out a little bit more later on when I start getting into a greater sense of analysis on what that ends up being when we apply it to the formal education sector. I'm just going to pause here and see if there's any questions. Can I sort of dove in and threw a bunch of words at you all in a row? Yeah. And if there's any questions that arise now, please dive in. I see Betty has a question. Do children do this better than adults? I think it's interesting because it's really a matter of what is being done. Because in order to form coherent worldviews, which is really the primary intent of our interaction with information, in order to form coherent worldviews, we actually need a certain degree of knowledge and the ability to connect those knowledge elements. And there's something in the research, Kaminsky in the literature area at least states that people who have advanced knowledge structures are actually better able to navigate ambiguous information settings. then people who are new to a space, they actually require a degree of structure in order to begin to form some of these settings. So perhaps the focus on the age may be less fruitful area of exploration than if we focus on the knowledge of the individual, because the more knowledgeable we are, the more capable we are of connecting elements. Norman, do I think data is property? Yes, I do. Carol, perhaps also the experienced application of this knowledge. Yeah, I would say certainly. I mean, to a degree, this application shouldn't be individualistic. It should be driven by a network structure of interaction, this notion of self-organization, which I'll get into in a little bit. Well, Norman, if I said people were property, then you should probably take me out and shoot me, because that would be a bad perspective. No, I absolutely do not think that people are property. Except kids. Kids are property up until a certain age. You can do what you want with them and make them clean your house and mow the lawn and stuff like that. Any other questions? No, Norman, data does not make up people. This, biologically, that's who we are as people. And data, DNA, is a component or a representation or an analysis of that structure when you render it into a DNA structure, but that's very different than, let's say, digital information and digital structure. For example, if I look at data and if I have a blog post and you copy it, that's the same thing. But, if I have one arm and you take it, then I'm suddenly missing one arm, which is a bad thing. And so I think in that regard, there are elements in which data has properties at a DNA level, but I think it's quite different than the approach that you get when you copy data in a different way. I don't think you can yet, Norman, to be honest. If you biologically have the means to do that, then perhaps it would be fine, but at this point you can't. Okay, so I'm going to leave it, at least you can't duplicate it. You might be able to transplant it, but you can't duplicate it. All right, so I'm going to leave that area of discourse and move on. I don't see if there's any other questions coming out. But so at this point, I want to turn to how we start to make sense of this model in an educational context. Because if we're facing this climate where information is abundant, and we're facing this challenge where we are relying on social means to try and organize that information structure, and then we start to rely on different systems to help us orient ourselves meaningfully to the world, then we have to ask questions that come down really to who decides how that information is structured. Right now, the university decides for us, essentially. They'll say, this is, what you're going to take in this course. This is the curriculum that's important in this topic, and we kind of have to toe the line. Now, I know that's perhaps a little bit more direct than it actually needs to be, because there's certain areas of peripheral exploration with curriculum, but by and large, the educator or an instructional designer decides what we need to learn, and generally also how we're going to learn it. So in this regard, a self-organizing social system, this is based on an article by, I think it was Aaron Edwards, David Wiley. They look at, this is from 2003, there is an increasing ability where people can self-organize through a huge array of tools and technologies that are now surprisingly commonplace and surprisingly easy for people to use and begin to interact with. Now, these self-organizing systems are essentially defined by complexity. And complexity and complexity science, which I think really is, if you boil down all of the stuff of Web 2.0 and all of this discussion of social networks and even this growth of analytics and mining, I think you get to a point where the core foundational change that we face educationally is that the system that we're premising everything on is a complex system. And a complex system is one where you have a diverse group of actors that are interacting dynamically. And this happens in a continual space of feedback. So what I mean by that is, if we end up looking at the world in a complicated way, then we see everything as having a proper place. It's like a watch where every piece belongs, or a puzzle piece where every piece belongs. A complex system, in contrast, is more like a weather system. And in this kind of a model, everything is technically in flux, and we can only know an outcome based on how the elements interact. That means that we can say tomorrow's going to be sunny, but if a cold front moves more rapidly than another front does, it'll change the outcome of the weather. And so that's what we're looking at when we say these are dynamic systems that are interacting with one another, and it's occurring in really a sea of feedbacks. Okay, so with those last two slides, which technically should be about a course in their own right, namely the one on complex